In this series, we'll learn how to use Blender's 3D and 2D tools to create this awesome Toon shaded scene. We'll be modeling and texturing and even using the grease pencil tool for our 2D character. So let's jump right in.
TipTut.
Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut and to this Blender series where we'll be working with the 3D and 2D tools to create complete scenes from start to finish. We'll start by modeling this basic scene, moving on to adding the foliage, working with particle systems and modifiers, then we'll texture everything in a Toon shader style and add 3D animation. Then add a 2D animated character with the grease pencil tools. I will say that I'm still evolving as a Blender user, so this is just the way that I do things. If you do know of a better way, please feel free to share that in the comments, but this is a workflow that I've used to create full animations from start to finish. In this first episode, we'll be modeling and texturing the basic scene, so let's just jump right into it. Okay then, so let's get started. The first thing you should do is just get used to moving around in Blender if you've never used it before. I highly recommend using a mouse for this one because the middle mouse button is how you move around in the viewport. Middle mouse will help you rotate the screen. If you hold Shift and click middle mouse, you can pan around the environment. And if you scroll in and out with the middle mouse wheel, then you'll zoom. If at any point during this tutorial you don't see what keys I'm pressing or I forget to say, you can actually see that in the bottom left here, I've got a key reader built in. So anything that I type to bring up any menu will appear down there in the bottom left. I recommend you just get used to playing around with the system for a while. If you don't have a middle mouse or if you don't have a numpad on your keyboard, which I'll mention a few times, then anything I say with those controls can be done up here in this section. You can use this to move and rotate your viewpoint by clicking and dragging, zooming using this icon, panning using this icon, and entering and exiting the camera by clicking this icon here, like so. I'll be using all the keyboard shortcuts to do those things. So if you don't have those specific keys on your keyboard, you can still follow along. With that in mind, we're just going to jump right in. I'm not going to do a boring thing when we go through all the interface and teach you all about it and things like that. We're going to do it as we use it because that's the best way to learn. So the first thing we need to do is start setting up our environment with a simple ground plane for everything to sit on. So let's do that first. If you watch any Blender tutorial, then you know the first thing you do is delete the default cube. So I'm going to select that with a left click. I'm going to press X on my keyboard and then choose delete just to get rid of that. And we're going to bring in a plane, which is just a flat surface for our world to sit on. So Shift A, and then under mesh, we're going to choose plane. Before we click anything else, even rotating the camera, we're going to see this little menu down here in the bottom left that I'm going to expand, and I'm going to set the size of my plane to be 10 meters by just typing in 10 and hitting enter. You'll notice that as soon as I left click anywhere else or rotate the camera, that menu does disappear. So you need to make sure that you don't accidentally click away. We are in currently called object mode, where we can select and move things around. If I press G, for example, I can grab this and move it around in my environment, and just Control Z to undo that. What we want to do is make this ground lumpy. Okay, so we're going to press Tab, which brings us into edit mode, and you can see that I can start selecting the individual points of this plane. If I tab again, we go back to object mode. If up here in the top left, you can actually navigate between all the different modes by this drop down menu, but we're going to go into edit mode. Okay, we're going to press A, which will select all of the points on our plane. So if I select just top left or top right, you can see it glow orange. If I press A, it's going to grab everything. We're going to right click and we're going to choose subdivide, and that's going to cut our plane into a whole bunch of segments. And we're just going to do that a few times until we get squares that are nice and small, something like that, so we can start manipulating our environment. Anywhere where there is one of these vertex points, we can move or manipulate it. So if I press G, which is the shortcut for the move tool, G for grab, I can start moving this around in 3D space. And if I left click, you can see that confirms that. However, we don't want just to affect this one individual point. So I'm going to turn on something called proportional editing by clicking this button up here in the top. Then when I select a point and press G, you'll notice we get a circle around our cursor, and everything inside that circle is being pulled proportionally based on the original selection. If you scroll with your mouse wheel, you can make that circle bigger and smaller, and we can just start pulling, selecting single points with the left click, and just start pulling our plane up and around in different areas. So going around the edges, selecting a point, pressing G, and just pulling it upwards. Okay, and we're going to do that, and we're going to create basically like a little beach area, like a little grassy beach in the middle. Let's create a dip in our river here. So I'm going to press 2, not numpad 2, but the normal 2. And you'll notice that my dots disappear, and instead I can start selecting lines. So you have 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. 1 allows you to select individual vertexes, 2 individual edges, and 3 individual faces, which are everything between 3 or more vertexes. So I'm going to press 2 to select edges, and I'm going to hold Alt and then select this edge down here, which will select the entire edge for me. Then I'm going to press G again and start to move it down, but I only want to move it on the Z axis. I don't want it to go backwards. I don't want it to go sideways either. I just want it to go up and down. So to do that, press G for move and then press Z to lock it to the Z axis and bring it downwards. If you start scrolling, you'll see that we can start to dip our ground a little bit. That's looking about right. We don't have enough riverbed to be working with, so I'm actually going to extrude this face, which means to add another face based on what you've got selected. And I'm going to do that by pressing E for extrude, and then Y to lock it to the Y axis, and just extrude that out like so, so that I've got a bit more of a riverbed. Now we want to subdivide this area so that it's got squares like the rest of our mesh here. But the best way to do that once you're inside a mesh that's already kind of established is to press Ctrl R to bring up your loop cut tool. And you can see we get this yellow line. If I hover this yellow line in the middle and scroll up, I increase the amount of lines that I can create. Left clicking confirms my selection. You can see I can then slide it around on the faces. But if I choose right click, it will pop it slap bang in the middle. And voila, we now have a dip in our mesh. So I'm going to go back to vertex mode and continue tweaking this until I'm happy. That's looking pretty good, but it's looking a bit steep actually. So I'm going to press A to select everything like we did before. Then I'm going to press S for scale, okay? And then I'm going to press Z to only scale along the Z axis. And you can see I can then make everything deeper or shallower based on my selection. I'm just going to make everything just a little bit shallower. That's looking perfect. Let's press Tab again to go back into object mode. And you can see now we've got a cool looking ground plane. I'm going to press G and then Z as well to bring it up just so that the bottom of our plane here is resting roughly on the floor of our world. Let's add a bit more variation to this though, using some modifiers. I'm going to right click this and choose Shade Smooth. You can see at the moment, if we go to say like shaded view, rendered view up here, you can see that we get these kind of weird crosses on some of our content. If we click right click and Shade Smooth, that gets rid of that for us. And we're going to use some modifiers to make this all lumpy and bumpy. So let's go back to viewport shading solid so that we can only see our solid, doesn't apply any of our lights. And we're going to click this little spanner down here and choose add modifier. The modifier we're going to add to this, first of all, is a subdivision surface, which basically allows us to double the amount of squares in our mesh without doing any extra work. And we're going to make sure that both of those are set to 2, which is just going to smooth it up a little bit further. Then we're going to add a new modifier on top called a displace modifier. Now that's going to add some lumpiness. I need to give it basically a texture to displace it with. So we're going to click this plus new here, and we'll just rename this lumpy ground. Okay. And with that lumpy ground texture, you can see that we've got this kind of grid icon. If you then click the red grid icon that looks the same down here in your texture properties, we choose basically a texture to displace this map with. And we're going to choose the one called Voronoi, which creates this crazy kind of lumpy surface, which is perfect for what we want, but it's a bit too intense at the moment. Basically what this is doing is everywhere there is black, it's not going to move the mesh, and everywhere where it's white, it's going to move the mesh up to the extent of our properties. Everywhere that's in between that is going to create these lumps by doing it proportionally. I'm quite happy with the size. Let's leave that where that is for now, but I don't want the intensity so much. So I'm going to scroll down colors here, and I'm going to just drag my contrast all the way down. 0.04, let's try. That looks pretty good. We just got some nice lumps and bumps in our ground. And now we've got a pretty good lumpy bumpy plane. The good thing about this as well, if I select my object, press tab to go back into edit mode, I can continue to just tweak these points as well. Create a bit more of a valley in the middle of our river here. It will have updated the mesh and procedurally recreated all this detail. So if we made this detail with a mesh, it would be crazy to then edit later on. But we don't need to because we've done it with modifiers. So let's make sure we name this. We'll just call this ground. So we've now got our ground plane set up and we're feeling pretty good. I'd like to make a wall that goes around the edge of this plane, okay? Like a cliff edge. So let's do that. First of all, let's hide our ground plane temporarily by clicking this eye icon here, just to turn it off. It's still there, it's just not visible in the viewport. Let's press Shift A, Mesh, and Cube, and we're going to bring in a new cube object, same as the default cube. We're going to scale this along the x-axis by pressing S and X to scale like so. Let's make it nice and long. And we'll scale it along the Y as well, S and Y, until we get something relatively deep. And we'll make it a little bit bigger, S and Z, something like that. If I go to my item properties up here, You can press this N, which is a shortcut, by the way, to expand or contract this view. You'll notice that my scale is now at 15, 3, and 1 because we've made this bigger than what it is. Whenever you make changes to an object like this, we scale that in object mode, not in edit mode. You want to apply them by pressing Control A and just applying all transforms, or in this case, just scale, because we've only done the scale. That resets the scale back to 1, and then any modifiers you apply to it will apply based on a scale of 1 as opposed to whatever your new value is. And that's super important for later on. So that's just Control A, apply. Right, let's press Tab to go into edit mode, and let's start adding some detail to this mesh. I'm going to subdivide it a whole bunch of times, pressing Control R, making this yellow line appear, and just scrolling all the way up. Something like that looks pretty good to me. Left click and then right click to release. That's looking pretty good. Now I want to create some lumpy bumpy cliff face edges just along this edge here. So I'm going to press 3 to go to face select mode. And you'll see now I can just start holding shift and left clicking randomly on any of these faces here to start selecting random faces. Something like that seems pretty good. Let's then press G for move. Okay. And this time we're going to make sure we turn off proportional editing. So we're just going to turn off that option up there. G for move, and then Y to only move it back in Y space. I'm just going to push these back a little bit. Then we're going to see where there's any flat portions, and with a little bit more control, we're going to just start bringing these forward with G and Y. And we're going to start creating these kind of lumpy and bumpy surfaces. So fairly happy with that lumpy bumpiness. You can see here that we've now got the front face of our edge. Still looks a bit too uniform for me though. So I'm going to press Control R again for loop cut, but this time we're going to loop cut horizontally, and we're going to add in a few more segments. And we're going to do exactly the same thing, but this time we have to select all the way along a horizontal edge. To do that, I'm going to hold Alt. Again, I'm in edge select mode here. I'm just going to hold Alt, and I'm going to click any one of these vertical lines. You'll see that how that will select the vertical loop. If I press horizontal line, it will select the horizontal loop. Okay, I can either pull them back like this just by pressing G and then Y, like so. Or if you want to move a whole face, you can press 3, hold Alt and click, and it will select the whole face, and you can start pulling those whole segments. As you can see, the results are pretty much the same. Okay. We want that overlap to be more pronounced though. So I'm going to press Control R again for a loop cut, left click. So I accept it, slide it right up to the top. Boom, and click it there. So we've got a loop cut right under the edge. Let's hold Alt, click, GY, and we'll create a nice lip at the top. You can see we've got some lumps on the back. It doesn't really matter, but if you want to fix those, what you can do is make sure you're in face select mode and just select all those faces along the back. If you're having trouble selecting them, you can turn on X-ray mode up here to see through your object. And then when you select all the faces, you'll see you can select everything all the way through. Do be careful though, because you can select obviously everything from every side with X-ray mode turned on. So make sure that you're only selecting the faces that you want and nothing else. Once you've selected them, press S for scale, Y to scale it along the Y axis, and then 0 to make them scale to 0. And bam, there you go. We now have a box with a wobbly front edge. Let's apply some Voronoi to this. We're going to right click it. First of all, turn off X-ray mode, right click and shade smooth to create our smooth edges like this. Then let's apply a subdivision surface to make it a little bit lumpier and bumpy smoother. And we'll put that at say like 3. 3 seems about right to me. You'll do notice that it's curving the edges of our cliff as well. Not too much of an issue at the moment. But if you wanted to stop that from happening, you could add in another loop cut and just bring it over to the edge like this. And that will really sharpen up your edges again. All right, that's looking pretty good. Let's add another modifier on top of that. Okay, we're going to add a displacement modifier, and we're going to call this one new, and we'll just call it Cliff Lumpy. We'll go back down to our textures, and we'll add the exact same thing as last time. We're going to do a Voronoi, okay? Kind of crazy at the moment, but of course we're going to take that all the way down. Let's try the same amount of contrast, 0.04. Looking very nice there. Last thing we need to do to stop this kind of stretching only going in one direction here, tab into edit mode, Control R, and scroll to create a bunch of crosses like this, and then right click like so, and then your lumps will be in all directions. So we now have a very lumpy cliff, which we're pretty happy with. I'm just going to grab that in object mode and press G and Y to move it back in space. Then we're going to turn back on our ground. Let's bring this in so that the back of the ground intersects like so. But what we really want is this to sort of curve around our plane, okay? So we're going to do that with yet another modifier. Before we do, I'm just going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to press A to select everything. I'm going to scale Y sorry, I'm going to scale along the X just a little bit. I think we need to be a little bit longer. So what we need to do is make a path for this shape to follow. So to do that, we're going to, first of all, turn on X-ray mode so that we can see through our objects, because we're going to be bringing in mesh plane. And if you don't click anything else, it should already be 10 meters in size, which is perfect for us. But let's now press tab to go into edit mode for this plane, 2 to go into edge select. And we're just going to select this front edge, X to delete, and then choose edges. What that leaves us with is this kind of U shape here with no face or anything like that. Back in object mode, I'm going to right click that face and choose convert to curve. And that's going to turn it from a mesh object into something similar to like a pen line object from Photoshop or Illustrator. And we're going to call this one Cliff Curve. We'll call this cube as well Cliff. You need to always maintain your naming conventions. And on this Cliff object here, we're going to apply another modifier after all of the others, and it's going to be a curve modifier. The curve object we're going to set by clicking this eyedropper and hovering over our cliff curve. We're going to set to be that. Now it's going to go crazy, but don't worry. This is because we've offset the position of our cliff. So if I select my cliff object and I press G to move it, and let's move it, say, like along the Y-axis, you'll start to see that it moves back into shape just a little bit. So what we'll do is temporarily, we're going to hide this curve in the viewport, just turn that off so that we can see our original object. Then we're going to press, with the object selected, Shift and S, and we're going to go selection to cursor, and that's going to move the origin of this object to our 3D cursor. Bam, which should still be at the world origin. If your cursor isn't at the world origin, if you accidentally moved it somehow, perhaps by holding Shift and right clicking and accidentally moving your 3D cursor around, you can press Shift S and then choose cursor to world origin to put it back. Now when I turn my curve object on, it's going to be a little bit more like we want. It's curving around our object here, but as you can see, it's really offset. And that's because we need to move this in X space. So you can see at the moment, it's going to take the origin of our cube and attach it to one end of this line and then stretch it around the edge. So if I move this along the X-axis like so, and if I turn back on the curve, you'll start to see what's happening. You can start to shift this around your object a little bit. You can see I've actually got a bit much. So if I press tab to go into edit mode, you'll see the original mesh. I can scale this back down on the X. Bam, that's looking pretty good. So you'll notice that our cliff is on the outside, which is no good because we want the good information on the inside here. To fix that, we just select our cliff curve object, press tab to go into edit mode, and we're going to actually rotate this around the Y-axis by pressing R and then Y, and you'll notice you get some pretty wacky effects, but if you hold Control, you can lock it to 5-degree increments, and you can make it be 180 degrees so that you've got the perfect rotation. And now our cliff is on the inside. So now our cliff is facing the right way, but it's too far in, okay? So what we're going to do is move this cliff wall back away from the center a little bit. If I tab into edit mode, this is all based on the origin of our object. So if I then press G and Y with everything selected, I can move this origin back, press tab to go back into object mode, and you'll see that our cliff face is looking a bit more natural. I'm pretty happy with that, but I actually don't want the cliff on this side. So I'm going to tab back into object mode here and just press G and X to just slide that along like so. So I want this to have a little bit of a rotation to it. So I'm going to press R and then Y to rotate it on the Y axis. And this is going to like twist our entire cliff because remember, it's actually based on the origin object over here. So that's going to create a little bit of a slope, and then we can move down until our wall kind of just almost disappears on this other side here. So now we have the plane that we're working with, the cliff that we're working with, but it's time to add the last things on the hardscape, the grass and some rocks to scatter around. I'm going to select my cliff object here. I'm going to tab across into edit mode, and I'm going to go to 3 to select face mode. Then I'm going to press numpad 7 to go to top orthographic, which is basically just going to show me the very top edges of my plane. If you don't have a numpad, what you can do is hold Alt and then middle mouse and sort of drag downwards, and it will snap you to that view. And if you drag in different directions, you can snap to any of the axes views like this as well. Then I'm going to select everything on my top. Then I'm just going to check that I don't have any extra faces. I do have some selected here. So holding Alt and Shift, I'm just going to click these vertical lines here to deselect all these loops. And that leaves me with just the top faces selected. I'm going to press Shift D to then duplicate those faces and right click to release them. Then I'm going to press P for separate selection to a new object. And that's going to give us If we press tab again, that's going to give us a cliff section like so, and then a duplicate of that cliff section that is just to the top plane. As you can see, it has all of the same modifiers and things applied to it as well. We're going to add another modifier to this after all the others, called a solidify modifier. And that's going to basically just pretend that this plane then has some 3D-ness to it. We can increase the thickness to see what's going on there. So now that it's got some thickness and it's sitting on top of our cliff, as you can see here, we're just going to press S and we're just going to scale it up ever so slightly and bring it down so that it intersects with that mesh. And what that's done is basically just given us a little grassy lip that overlaps the top of our cliff edge like so. So we've now got a base to add some actual grass on later on in our scene. Okay, all right, let's add some rocks then. So to add a rock, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to press Shift A, mesh, and bring in a new cube. And just for simplicity, I'm just going to turn off everything else in my scene. Turn off my cliff base and my other cliff base. So we now have all of those. And this cube here, we're just going to rename to rock. I'm going to press G and Z just to bring it up in Z space a little bit. All right, let's add some modifiers to make this look a little bit more like a rock. So let's add a subdivision surface modifier, which is going to cut that rock up, leaving us with the same amount of vertices, but it's going to increase the smoothness. And let's pop this up to like 4. Right click that and choose Shade Smooth, and all of a sudden our cube is now a sphere. Let's add another modifier onto that one, and it's going to be our old faithful displace. Go to our texture settings, and we will once again choose Voronoi, but this time we're going to increase the scale a whole bunch. Okay. Now, this again does depend on the scale of your mesh. So it's very important that when you start scaling this, you're not scaling in object mode, because you'll notice if I scale in object mode, it'll all look fine until I press Control A and apply the scale, and then we'll get a completely different shaped Voronoi. With that in mind, I'm going to scale this rock down in object mode because I'm aware that I need to apply it. I'm going to press G to move it back a bit, and then GZ to move it down a bit, and GX to slide it along. And we're just going to use this as like a rough position that we're going to be putting our rock in. So I'm going to go down to my colors. I'm going to decrease the contrast, but I'm going to increase the scale a little bit. Before I do, Control A, apply the scale. You can see how that makes it different based on the size of the rock. And you can start to see where we're going with this. Okay, we're going to just decrease the size until we get something a little bit more extreme than our lumps here. That's looking pretty good to me, but it's not the right shape. So I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to press 3 to go to face selection. And I'm going to press Control R to loop. And I'm going to loop cut my rock a few times vertically like that. Okay. Then with face selection on, so that's 3, I'm just going to start grabbing with G and Y to bring them out. Just start moving these faces around. Okay. Let's press Control R this way and add in a few loop cuts so that we can modify in all directions. And as you can see, this is really going to drastically affect the shape of your rock. But if your Voronoi is too strong, it might start folding in on itself. So you might need to decrease the contrast a little bit, just until you get something that you're vaguely happy with. I'm vaguely happy with the shape of that rock. Of course, you can always come back and tweak it later. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start positioning it properly in my scene. I'm going to press 7 to go to top view and then R to rotate. Then I'm just going to Shift D to duplicate that rock, right click to release it, G and Y to move it forwards. Okay, then G and Z. Let's rotate it again a little bit, maybe choose a different angle. If I now go into my mesh here and I just start pulling around a few different vertices, you can start to see, especially with proportional editing turned on, how you can really quickly create some variations on rocks and things like that. Okay. In fact, if I just grabbed all of this with A in edit mode and then scaled it down along the Y axis, we can create a more lumpy rock. So let's move that back as well. And then let's duplicate that again. Right click to release, move it into position, rotate around the Z axis maybe this time, and start to bring that down. So you can start to see, bam, we've got some really interesting ways to create some nice rocks here. So I'm going to add a few more of these to the scene, and then I'll get back to you. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy with that as my scene. I am going to increase my X scale of this plane a little bit just so that the ground does extend fully into the rocks and things. Then I'm going to press Control A and apply that scale so that my Voronoi works correctly. All right, now that we have modeled our hardscape, probably best to add a little bit of texture to this so we can start to see what the final scene might look like. So at the moment we've been working in solid view mode. So all you can see is the basic shapes that we've applied. Okay. Up here in these settings, we have wireframe mode, we have solid mode, we have material preview, which at the moment we don't have any materials, and we have a render preview mode, which shows us what our scene might look like when it's rendered, including lights and things. So if I select this existing light object, you can see that I can move it around and it affects the light of our scene. And we're going to use this light just as a basis for now to get some materials down, and we'll light our scene properly later on. So let's start with the rock, because that's probably the simplest thing. It's a one material object. I'm going to go to my shading tab, and we're going to make sure we're in render preview mode in this viewport as well here. So we're going to click this plus new button here, which is going to give us a new node material. And you can navigate this window in the same way that you navigate the other viewports with shift and middle mouse and things like that. Now, all materials in Blender are based on nodes, which are these little boxes here, and you connect these boxes together with strings to create your materials. So you can see if I disconnect this BSDF principled node from my material output node, we lose the current default material that is on our texture. So just try and follow along, and trust me, once you've been using a Blender a little while, you'll start to realize what some of the nodes do. And even by the time you finish this series, you'll have a better understanding of how they work. I need to add a new mode that takes all of this complicated information here and just translates it to straight RGB channels. So to do that, I'm going to press Shift A, search for shader, and we want shader to RGB. Then Shift A, search for a color ramp, hit enter, and we're going to drop that in. We're going to connect the color of the RGB to the factor of the color ramp, and the color out of the color ramp to our surface. And now you can see we're back where we started. Okay. However, if we change this linear option to constant here, you'll see we get a perfectly black shape. And that's because it's basically taking the RGB value, and the more light that hits this object, the further right in this collection of colors here is going to select a color from. So what this means is if I move this white slider down, you'll start to see some of the white hitting this rock here. If I now move my light in the scene, you can see that that changes the shadows on our rock. And that's going to be the principle for basically all of our cartoon Toon shading in this series. So let's select this rock again. But obviously we do not want our rock to be black and white. That looks rubbish, okay? We want some real colors. Now, the best way to work with real colors when working with a color palette like this, I've found, is to bring in your color palette into Blender. So we're going to press Shift A up here in this preview window, and we're going to bring in an image reference, okay? And before we do that, however, I'm going to hold Alt and I'm going to snap to my front view, because the angle of your view is the angle in which it brings in the reference image. So Shift A, image reference, and I'm going to find my folder. And inside here, I have an asset called complete palette. Let's load that in. And that's going to load in this reference image, which I can move upwards with GZ and backwards with GY. And no lights will affect a reference image at all. Additionally, it will not render either. You don't even have to worry about turning it off. We'll select our rock here, like so, okay? And we're going to say, right, whenever light hits this rock, on the brightest area, I want this color. To eyedrop, I want my brightest gray, okay? I'm going to add in a few more points with this plus button here, and I'm going to say the less light that hits it, the further down these grays is going to pick the gray from. Let's add in one more and make the darkest one this kind of bluish gray here, like that. In fact, let's go even further. Let's slide these up. And as you can see, the distance between these points is very important. You'll be tweaking this later on as you actually light your scene properly. But for now, we'll just leave them kind of roughly where they are. You can see that I can tweak these around so that you can basically have things like rim lights, or more powerful or darker objects like that. Let's do something like that for now. And as you can see there, we now have a material shader on our rock that as the light moves, so too does the color of our rock, which looks really good. Awesome. However, we want to add like a nice big chunky border to our rock as well. Okay, now to do that, we need to add a second material slot to this object. So let's go down to our material properties panel here, and you can see that we now have material 1, which I'll quickly rename to just stone, okay? We have material 1 in the first slot. Let's add a new slot to this object, which is empty, And in there, we're going to add a new material. So this plus new and this plus new do the same thing. We'll just do new material and we'll call this one border. Okay. We don't want a principled BSDF for this one. So we'll disconnect that and just delete it. All we want for this is a simple emission shader. So that's Shift A, emission. And we'll connect the emission to the surface. Bam. And we'll make this very nearly black. Let's do like this darkest color here and then darken it up a bit more. Okay, nothing has happened at the moment because we have made a second slot for this object and we've applied a texture to it, but there's nothing telling us like where to put it. Now we want to apply a modifier to this rock that allows us to kind of create a crunchy border around the edges. So we'll choose add modifier and we will choose solidify, which is going to bump up our rock a little bit if we play with these thickness settings here. Okay, now here's the important thing. Put all these rocks in place, but none of the scale has been applied. So if I now press Control A and apply the scale, you can see that it's going to change my settings and it's going to change how much my border influence affects it. So make sure you have applied your scale, and I'll show you why again later when we actually get this border to be visible. We've applied a solidify setting on here. What we need to do now is flip the normals on that solidify setting, and then in our materials panel for border, we need to turn off backface culling. Okay. The final step for getting to this to work is we need to make sure we're choosing the border material for our solidify modifier. So to do that, we just go down to the materials options here and we choose material offset by 1. Okay, flip the normals. And as you can see, we now have a chunky black border around the edge of our rock wherever we see an open edge that isn't connected. All right, let's apply this to all of our other rocks then. I'm literally going to go over to my panel here, just choose all the rocks, shift click all of them, and then I'm going to shift click in the scene this original rock with all of the settings so that it's got this yellow border around it. Then we're going to press Control L and we're going to choose link materials. Bam, that's worked for our gray. But then we're going to have to copy the modifiers, which is just going to add that solidify modifier to everything. And voila, you can see now that we have this border around everything. Some of the smaller rocks, however, it's very thin. Okay, and it's thicker on the larger rocks. And that's because we haven't applied the scale like I mentioned before. Now, I left it to this step just to show you what happens. If you don't apply the scale, and then you select everything and you do with Control A, watch what happens to our material. Bonk, it changes slightly, okay? Now, with the rocks, doesn't really matter too much because they're rocks, right? They still look just as good, they look fine, and now all of our borders are the same thickness. However, on these smaller rocks here, that you can see that some of the meshes might get a little bit ballsed up with that because they're now too small and the modifiers are being applied too hard. So if I then went down to our displace modifier here on one of the smaller rocks and I started changing contrast on it, you'll notice it would start changing on absolutely everything, every instance of that rock, which obviously isn't what we want. So this is why it's important to apply your scale first, because what we need to do now is on some of these smaller rocks is perhaps go over to our displacement modifiers here, okay, and just get rid of it first of all, see if that works, because you might not need to displace such a small rock for it to look good. And if you do, then you'll need to apply a new displacement modifier with a different settings for smaller rocks. I quite like the look of them just by turning these displace modifiers off. They're so small that they don't really need it for it to look good, okay? Now, that rock is done. Applying this texture to our dirt cliff is exactly the same, apart from we just choose brown instead of gray, okay? So let's quickly do that. I'll do that in fast forward mode, and I'll do the same thing where I apply the borders and inverting the normals and all of that. One thing you can do, you can see here that I've done my dirt texture, and I just want to do the same thing for the grass but green, is you can just copy your nodes, and then when you create a new material, and we'll call this one, grass, you can then just paste those nodes into there, and it's going to create the same objects. And then obviously what we need to do is just select different colors for our grass. So I'm going to choose like the brightest yellow here for the very peaks, and then just go down the shades of green. Okay, so that's starting to look good. All of our objects that have a single material are now textured. And of course you can play with like the thickness of your borders and things like that to get something that you're happy with. But what we want for the ground plane is for it to be sand down in this section, a thin line of mud, and then the grass color. So to do that, we actually start to need mixing materials on a single object. So it's a little bit more complicated, which is why I left it till last, and it's the last thing we'll do for this episode, okay? To start off with then, I'm going to select my object, go into the shading panel, and we're going to create a new texture, and we'll call this one ground. In the ground texture, we're just going to delete the principal BSDF so that we're starting off with pure black. Let's copy, first of all, let's go to grass as an example, and we'll just copy all of the nodes except material output. Now, if we go back to ground, we're going to reapply ground to our plane, but all we really wanted to do was copy and paste this object here. From this, we're going to make a basic sand material, okay, by just doing the same thing that we did for the grass and just selecting these brighter colors here. So we have ground now that is all sand, okay, but we don't want just that. So we're going to disconnect that from our material output. We're going to select all of these 3 nodes, and we're going to press Ctrl-G to group them together. And that's going to pop them in their own group, okay? Then we'll connect the group input to the base color of the BSDF and the group output to the color of the color ramp, which basically just means like, it's like a folder. We're going into the folder and back out of the folder. Like so. So if I now go up a level, bonk, you can see that back in our ground texture, we have here a node group that if I select this little icon, inside it is our sand. So we're going to rename this one sand. Don't get confused. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back to our cliff wall texture. We're going to disconnect from the material output. We're going to group. Okay. We're going to connect to the group inputs and outputs, go back up a level and just connect that group back to the surface. Exactly the same thing, apart from our dirt is now in a group, which we're going to call cliff wall. We're actually going to use this for the dirt as well, but it's mainly the cliff. Now we're going to go to our grass because that's the third material that we want to mix. We'll disconnect that. We'll group these. We'll put the input and the output. We'll go back up a level and we'll reconnect it. So we're just basically grouping our original textures, and we'll call this new node group grass. All right. Now make sure that we go back on our object here and apply the ground texture to it. So we're back where we were before. We now have a sand node group. And if I press Shift A, I can go down to my groups here and I can bring in a cliff wall node group. And I can press Shift A again and bring in a grass node group. And we're going to mix all 3 of these into one texture, essentially. We have to do it in like 2 stages though. Whatever you want your base texture to be, let's say we want it to be base sand, then on top of that mud, then on top of that grass, because that makes the most sense, right? We will connect 2 of them with a mix shader. So Shift A, search, and just choose mix. And we want mix shader like that. This mix shader, we're going to put the color of the cliff wall into the first slot and the color of the grass into the second slot. Then if we connect just temporarily this shader to the material output, you'll start to see something interesting, okay, in preview render mode. So you can see here, if I change the factor of this all the way down to 0, what that's going to do is choose whatever texture or material is going into this first slot and apply it completely. If this factor was set to 1, it's going to take whatever material is in the second slot and apply that completely. If I press say 0.5, it's going to mix the 2 colors together. Not exactly what we want. What we want is this factor, what is visible from material 1 and what is visible from material 2, to be a mask. We want to choose the area in which it is masking. So what we'll do is we'll disconnect this from the surface, first of all. And we'll disconnect these from the shader as well. So what we'll do is we're going to group all of these together. Ctrl-G. Group input we don't really need. We just need the group output. And the cliff wall is going to go into top one. Grass is going to go into the bottom one. Then we're going to go back up a level. We now have 2 groups that we can mix together. Sand and a node group that contains 2 of our other materials. We'll call this one dirt, grass. On this level, we're going to add a mix shader. Okay, mix shader. We're going to connect color 1 into the slot 1, color 2 into slot 2, and that into there. So now we're mixing the sand, which currently, okay, if we put that to 0, it's just going to show just the sand across the entire surface. There we go. And the dirt, which contains 2 colors across the rest of the surface when we apply our mask to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our dirt grass group and just temporarily set the factor of this to 0 so that it only shows our cliff wall material, which is the dirt material, right? Let's go back up a level and we're going to set this factor to be a mask. So it's going to mix the sand and the dirt together. To do that, we need an image texture. So Shift A and then image texture. And we're going to connect the color output of this image texture to the factor of here, this input. All right. Now we need to create a new image for this. So we're going to press plus new. Let's just zoom in a little bit so you can see what's going on. We're going to press plus new and we're going to call this one sand dirt mask. It's important. This is a really large area. So we're actually going to set this to be, say, like 2048 pixels wide by 2048 pixels tall. Okay, because this is going to be an actual image that we create and we're going to click OK. Now that's going to create an image for us that we're going to be able to paint using the UV editing tab and the texture paint tab. So if we go to texture paint now, you'll see that we're in a new window and we have like this black texture here. And on the window on the left here, I can start using my brush to paint a mask. And wherever I paint, it's going to pick one color that is white is going to be the color from color 1, sand. And one color is black is going to be color 2, which is the dirt. What we want is a nice hard brush because we're going for like a cartoon thing. So we're going to go down to our fall off here. Okay. And we're just going to choose flat. So that's going to create a really hard, crunchy brush for us. But you can see at the moment, you might start to paint and it would seem to work. But you'll notice here that I got to the point where I extended my mesh earlier to create like the riverbed. And it's kind of ballsed up a little bit there. And that's because we need to just unwrap what is called unwrapping our plane so that the computer sees it once again as a flat square, this flat square that we can then draw on. It's really simple to do that, especially for a plane. We're just going to go to our UV editing tab. Okay. We're going to press A to select everything. We're going to press U and then unwrap. Okay. And as you can see, you can kind of see now like where the changes are in our plane. We made it lumpy and bumpy. Now back in texture paint, I can paint on this to my heart's content and it's going to create exactly the shape that I want. So I'm just going to click save and save everything. I'm going to go to material preview mode and you can see that we're previewing sand at the moment. And if I start painting, we'll start previewing the dirt. Okay. So let's choose where we want our dirt to appear. I'm just going to bring the radius of my brush down. And I'm going to say sort of like maybe something like this. Let's have it be like that. Come around like this. And we want that to be dirt, like so. And I go, okay, well, actually, I maybe want the sand to extend sort of upwards and away into this corner like that. So maybe we want that. And then if we paint white, that's going to bring the dirt back in. And if you paint obviously in like mid gray, then that's obviously going to bring halfway through the dirt and the sand together. We want it cell shaded though, so I'm not going to paint halfway. I'm just going to paint completely. So we've got some dirt like this. And if we go to material preview, you'll start to see that our dirt is still respecting the light in our scene, which is fantastic. So you can paint in material preview, but you might see a little bit of lag. However, at the moment, we've now just got sand and dirt. We haven't got any grass in there. And that's where our next bit of shading comes in. This is where it gets really clever. We're now going to do the same thing. Before we do, however, very important, I go back to my texture paint. Okay. I'm going to go down to my image. See, there's a star next to this image. I'm just going to hit save, just that we save this image. We can create a new folder. We'll call this assets. And inside that folder, you can see that it's the image we created earlier, sand dirt mask. We're going to hit save as image. And that's going to make sure that we're all good to go. So back in shading then, we are now showing this dirt grass everywhere that is black on that original mask, right? So what we want to do now is go inside this node here and do the same thing. Where there is color 1, we want the dirt, and where there is color 2, we want the grass. So we're going to go Shift A, add a new image texture, ponk, connect that color to the factor of our mix shader, like so. Let's just move these nodes about so they're a bit easier to see what's going on. We'll say new image, and we'll call this one dirt grass mix, or whatever it is I called it before, I can't remember. 2048 is fine. Okay, then back in texture paint mode, we're just going to start painting in the grass. Now, all of this eventually is going to actually have grass particles on top of it, so I'm not super bothered because it's going to be blocked up. But as you can see, we've now got 3 textures mixed on a single plane, and you could even mix in a 4th if you wanted to. Yeah. So back in layout mode, let's go to our Viewport shading. Oh, we forgot to save our image. Plonk. Dirt grass mix. Oh, I should have called it mask. I was a fool. I called it mix. Bam. There we go. We can start to see what our scene might look like. All right. It's looking a bit shiny at the moment. I'm going to turn this light down a little bit by selecting our light, going to our light properties here. And I'm going to change the power to like 500, 600. And we're going to turn the radius off so that we get perfectly sharp corners. Let's press 0 to look through our camera. Or of course you can click this little camera icon here. And I'm actually going to go to view and I'm going to check this camera to view. What that means is when I move this around, we're going to stay inside the camera. And I think the first shot of our animation is probably going to be something like that. Starting to add some textures to our scene, starting to add some shapes and modifiers and lightings and things like that. Looking pretty awesome. Final thing to do then before we end this episode is to make sure that all our colors are being represented properly on screen. Now to do that, very simple, we just need to go to our render settings here. First of all, check that you're in render engine Eevee. You should be, nothing should have changed. We're going to turn on ambient occlusion, which is shadows cast by other shadows, creating contact shadows, which very complicated and boring. We're going to scroll all the way down to hair. This is for later. And we're going to change it to strip. We're going to scroll all the way down to shadows. We're going to make sure that soft shadows are on or off, depending on your preference. You can see that the details down here, soft shadows, hard shadows. I prefer for this particular project hard, but it's up to you. We're going to turn film on and we're going to check transparent so that our background world is transparent, because we may or may not be using sky. And we're going to twirl down color management. This is the important one, and change it to standard pop, which as you can see, makes our colors pop way better and we get a more accurate representation of what our original colors were. Final settings you need to check are under your output properties. Just check that you're on 24 frames per second and that you've set your output folder by clicking this folder icon here to be somewhere that you will easily recognize. You can see I have assets and footage and tests. I'm going to create a new folder called renders and I'm going to pop inside that folder and choose accept. Now everything we create will be outputted there. The final thing is to go to your view layer properties and make sure that your Z pass is turned on. That's for later when we do our grease pencil objects. And that is everything, all of the setup you need for this world. So looking pretty good. Of course, some of those are optional. If you prefer the filmic look as opposed to the standard look, that's totally fine, up to you. But some of them are important, like the Z pass and things like that. Okay, that'll do for this time, I think. Next time, we're going to start adding the softscape, as I like to call it, to our scene, which is going to be the trees and the bushes and the grass and all the fun particle effects and things like that. For now, though, this is plenty to be getting on with, and you should have a pretty cool looking scene. So thank you very much for watching. I do hope you're enjoying this series. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Any questions, things like that, just drop them in the comments below. And I'm really, really looking forward to seeing you next time for the next episode of this one. I am stoked to carry on. So I'll see you then on TipTut. A gargantuan thank you to my level 2 and above members, without whom this channel would not be possible. If you'd like to support TipTut so that we can continue to grow, please consider clicking that join button below for exclusive perks and benefits.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.